The JSE is weaker with global peers mixed as investors await U.S. non-farm payroll data due later on Friday. FNB Wealth and Investments Portfolio Manager Wayne McCurrie joins us now to take a look at this and other business news. Thank you very much, Wayne, for your time this afternoon. Let's start with an overview of how the markets are faring at midday trade.
Yes, the market is down, but it's mainly the mining shares that are down, and there it's Anglo-American. And to be honest, I didn't find any particular information to cause Anglo-American to go down like this. I mean, two of their subsidiaries did give updates, which we can discuss yesterday, but the subsidiaries aren't down. It's only Anglo-American itself that's actually down quite significantly, down about 6%. And that's the one that's really pulling all the mining shares down. The rest of the market is negative, but not nearly as much as the mining shares.
Let's get into the Anglo subsidiaries. What do we see?
Yes, it is once again a reflection of, unfortunately, South Africa. Well, first of all, let's start with Kumba Iron Ore. They say Transnet just cannot carry enough iron ore to Saldanha, so therefore they're overstocked at the mines. In other words, their mine stockpiles now are at astronomically high levels. And as a consequence of that, they're cutting production this year, next year, and the following year by about 1 million to 2 million tons. Remember, they do about 36 million tons a year. So 1 or 2 million tons is going to be less production to align the production to what Transnet can actually carry on the railway line. And unfortunately, when you do that, there's going to be retrenchment, there's going to be job losses, there's going to be income losses in the whole Sishen, in the whole Sishen area and Katu area. Unfortunately, that's the case. Anglo-American Platinum is also got a few problems with, obviously, electricity supply, but they are also cutting production, but that's really to do with the market conditions. In other words, the prices are too low. They can't mine a few of their operations profitably at the current platinum and palladium and rhodium prices. So they're also cutting production. But surprisingly enough, Anglo-American Platinum is up. Kumba Iron Ore is basically unchanged. It's Anglo-American that's down 6%.
We'll get into Kumba in a few moments. But Wayne, you speak to some economists and they tell you it can't get worse than this. So this is the worst it'll get and it can only get better from here. Is that the outlook that you have?
Yes, essentially yes. Whether we are actually at the bottom now or whether it goes on another 3 months or 6 months, I don't know. But we are in the bottom of this particular phase of the cycle. And this cycle I'm talking about is the commodity cycle. In other words, Sibanye retrenching, Anglo-American retrenching, no capital investment, because both Kumba and Anglo-American Platinum have said they're cutting back on their capital expenditure. This is all very symptomatic of the bottom of a commodity cycle. South Africa is a very large commodity exporter. It's our biggest single export by far. And it affects us dramatically. So in other words, when the commodity cycle goes down, South Africa economic growth goes down and the rand weakens. And this coupled with higher interest rates is essentially, and of course throw in Transnet and Telkom, Transnet and Eskom and all the other problems that we have with service delivery with our government, is why we're in the state that we are. However, the biggest factor is the commodity cycle, and that should turn positive over the next 2 or 3 years. So I agree. This is probably around the worst that it gets. We should get interest rate cuts. The rand should strengthen on a 2 to 3 year view.
Another word that comes to mind that I hear economists say quite a lot, diversify your portfolio. If you're relying on commodities so much and when they sneeze, we catch a fever and a cold, what happened to this concept of diversification?
It's so difficult for a country to diversify. I mean, I've been hearing these words ever since I've been essentially working for the last 30 years. I've been hearing beneficiation. We must add value to the products that we export. And every single commodity producing country tells you exactly the same story. We can't just export the raw material. We must add value to it. And somehow, for whatever reasons, we and other commodity exporting countries are just unable to do this. I mean, maybe the countries that are getting it right, and we're not too sure about that yet, are the oil exporters. They have tried to diversify their economies dramatically. But take Saudi Arabia, 70% of their revenues, of the government's revenue, and the country's revenue, still comes from oil. But that's down from 95% 30 years ago. So, I mean, it's still massive, but at least there is a concerted effort to be less reliant on commodity exports. But for whatever reasons, whether you can't attract the skills or the capital, or it's not economically viable and you can't get sufficient production volumes to get your unit costs down, whatever the reason is, South Africa and many other commodity exporting countries have not been able to diversify sufficiently.
And therein lies the tragedy. Gold prices are on track for their first weekly fall after the dollar firmed. Was driving moves there?
Well, I mean, the dollar firm, you'll see what happens this afternoon when the non-farm payroll comes out. It's going to be critical information, that. But the dollar has been strengthening in the last while, and, when the dollar strengthens, gold goes down a little bit. But, no price goes up or down in a straight line, and gold has had an incredibly strong run. So 1 week of prices falling is actually not unusual at all.
Okay. You mentioned Kumba a little bit earlier on. They've provided an update on the company's full year 2023 guidance and the outlook on production for 2024 to 2026. Talk us through the numbers.
Well, they're going to be cutting production by between 1 million and 2 million tons per annum because they just cannot get the iron ore to the ports. And this has been a case. Now, obviously, nowadays it's probably worse than what it's been in the past, but Kumba has had logistical challenges for 20 years with Transnet. I mean, in the last commodity boom, let's say 2003 to 2008, the iron ore price went through the roof. It was incredibly high, and yet Kumba couldn't export any more iron ore because of constraints in the port and constraints on the railway line with Transnet. Now, this is all negative, and it's very easy to be negative in South Africa, but you must look on the positive side. At long last, there is actually action on Transnet and on Eskom. Eskom, you can produce as much electricity as you want to without being licensed and all of those complications. So it's just a question of time until the private sector starts to produce quite substantial amounts of electricity and we get out of load shedding. So maybe 2 years to go, maybe if you're optimistic a year to go, but there is an end to load shedding, and equally the same on Transnet. Effectively, the government is handing over the running of these big freight lines to the actual people who use them. I mean, they're not going to transfer ownership because you cannot use the word privatization in South Africa, but effectively it is privatization because the private sector has the capital and the expertise to get these infrastructure to run correctly, whereas Transnet hasn't got the capital or the expertise, it seems, to run them efficiently. So maybe it also takes a year or two, but there is also light at the end of the tunnel now, eventually on Transnet. I think our government, same as politicians worldwide, only really react and do the right thing when they are pushed totally and utterly into a corner and have no other alternative. So in other words, they try and defer the pain of difficult decisions until the very last moment. But that's where we are now, and the decisions have been taken.
When you mentioned the word privatization, and I agree, it makes a lot of people uncomfortable. What do you perceive that is down to, right? You speak to some economists and they tell you that the state needs to have capacity because it's got a mandate to serve its people. It's got a national interest mandate. And then you speak to some who tell you that, well, we're not so sure about the private sector because if you take a look at the track record, have they been patriotic, right? So has it led to also the lives of South Africans, and it's not at some level, right, being better. Yeah. And so what do you perceive makes us so uncomfortable as a country about privatization?
Well, look, first of all, you understand the private sector, generally speaking, and this is by far the overwhelming majority of private sector players, stick to the rules. Although you get the headlines and rand manipulation, the overwhelming majority of SA private sector stick to the rules. And, they'll do everything that's necessary to do business in South Africa. But fundamentally, the private sector is driven by profits. That is just, they are driven by profits. So they're never going to do something that's not profitable. That's for the government to provide that service if it's the private sector won't provide it if it's not profitable. And if they can make more money in the country next door, they'll go to the country next door or they'll go to the country overseas. The private sector is driven by profits. There's many, many other factors, but fundamentally the private sector is driven by profits. Now, governments are driven by ideology, serving the people, serving the poor, delivering services to the poor, and that's exactly where our government's driven. Our government is a very socialistic government, and I think true in the DNA of the ANC is they want to do a good job of delivering services to the people who can't afford those services. So they genuinely, I think honestly, in the heart of the ANC, they want to actually deliver the products and the services to the private sector. So therefore, the ANC in its ideology, and it's a good ideology, they want to control the railways. They want to control Eskom. They want to control many, many, many sectors of our economy because they truly believe, and correctly so, that the private sector won't provide those services at an affordable level, and the government must provide those services at affordable level. The problem is the government can't do it. That's the true problem, is that they can't provide those services that they want to provide for many, many reasons, and we know them all. So that's why we get this ideology battle. The moment you mention the word privatization, it is an admission by the government that they can't actually deliver what they truly want to deliver. Either there's too much corruption, too much incompetence, they haven't got the capacity, and that's why ideologically the privatization word is very, very difficult for our government to stomach. In other words, you wouldn't talk privatization if Eskom worked well, if Transnet worked well, if Denel worked well, if SAA worked well, if just about every other SOE worked well. No one will talk about privatization because there's no need to privatize it because it's actually working. The problem is it isn't working.
Fair enough. Maziv, the parent company of the fiber infrastructure providers Vumatel and Dark Fiber Africa, has 25 billion rand to spend on fiber expansion. Talk us through the expansion plans and funders.
Yes, this is very interesting. Standard Bank's come up with the money. This is Remgrandt's the ultimate big shareholder in all of this. It's a Vumatel business. And they're saying there's tremendous demand for fiber in the country, and they're rolling it out. I mean, they're doing a pilot project now in Alexandria where they can give you fiber, can give you internet access for 150 rand a month. I mean, that's fantastic. And if you can get that out and roll it out,
is the connection strong?
Imagine the cost. Imagine the costs that you will save on buying data. Because, data is everything now. No one talks on the phone anymore. We all talk via data, or we just use WhatsApp or whatever. So to be able to provide their current service runs at about, I think it's 400 rand a month. And you can buy many services at 300, 400, 500 rand a month. But if you can come in much cheaper, it might be a limited product, but it's fantastic that they're rolling it out. And clearly they see demand, and that's why they borrowed this money, is they want to go out there and lay fiber, which is very good news.
Wayne, speaking of fiber, so maybe in the north you'll see the cables run underground. When you go to some townships, there are these intrusive brown poles, and the fiber runs on those poles. Why?
I suppose it's just cheaper, and that's so you can just get it out there. It's just cheaper to put it on a pole than to dig a hole in the ground. It's quite interesting if you go to countries like Taiwan, not Taiwan, if you go to countries, you go to cities like Bangkok and Phuket in Malaysia, everything runs above ground. Your electricity cables, everything is above ground. So it's not actually that unusual to provide utilities above ground rather than below ground.
Okay. Maybe they can improve on the standard a little bit. Thank you very much, Wayne McCurrie, F&B Wealth and Investments Portfolio Manager.